haploid. There are some exceptions to that rule. There's a very, very small, primitive type of plant called a moss. And if you see a moss, it is actually a haploid type of plant. And I seem to recall certain types of insects are haploid. Like you see the ants walking around. I think each individual ant is a haploid organism, but I'm not 100% sure of that. Okay. Well, let's see now. So, remembering back that each chromosome carries its own set of genes, let's use the eye color gene, or focus in on the eye color gene for a moment. So, if these were your chromosomes, remember the eye color gene, its locus is on chromosome 15, so right there is the eye color gene you inherited from your mom, and right there is the eye color gene you inherited from your dad. But let's zoom in on it here. We know that people can have different, I guess the eye color gene is down there, okay. We know people can have different color eyes. There's, I guess that's Mel Gibson down at the bottom, and he has blue eyes. And the lady up on top, she's an actress also. I think her name is Barbara Stanwyck. She has brown eyes. So what's going on there? Well, it turns out there can be more than one version of the same gene. And the term for that is allele. So these people have different alleles of the eye color gene. Still the same gene. They use the word gene to define something that controls a trait, and certainly this gene is controlling a trait. It's controlling their eye color, but within that gene for eye color, you have different subcategories. You have the brown allele and the blue allele. At a molecular level, the difference between two alleles is a difference in the sequence, because of course genes are segments of the chromosome, which are DNA, and so they're made out of G's and A's and T's and C's. And so if you think of this as the brown color eye allele, and this is the blue color eye allele, they're almost the same, but if you look real closely, there's going to be a this difference between them somewhere. Here it is. In this particular, in the brown allele, there's a C at that spot and in the gene, and here there's a T. But other than that, all the nucleotides are the same. And so that typically is the difference between alleles, that they have a small variation in their nucleotide sequence. But remember, the nucleotide sequence controls the amino acid sequence of the protein, and the amino acid sequence of the protein controls how the enzyme is going to fold and what functions it's going to have. So even a minor difference in nucleotide sequence, like changing a C to a T, can give you a different protein with a slightly different function. And so that can lead to different physical traits, like blue eyes versus brown eyes. Alleles are different from each other sequence-wise, but I should also emphasize that they have a lot of similarities also. Most of the nucleotide sequence is the same between two different alleles. They're at the same locus on the same chromosome. You'll find both of these on chromosome 15 at the same locus. They are the same gene in the sense that they're controlling the same trait. They're both genes for eye color. They just have minor variations in their sequence, so you get different eye color. That sound all right? Okay, so imagine that Mel and Barbara were your parents. We should all be so lucky. Then we'd be rich and famous or something. So if from Mel you got the blue color gene, and you inherited the blue color allele for eye color gene, and from Barbara you inherited the brown allele for the eye color gene. Well, first of all, what would your eyes look like? Well, you would not have one blue eye and one brown eye, as interesting looking as that would be. What typically happens is one allele is stronger than the other allele. It's called the dominant allele, and the weaker one's called the recessive allele. And essentially your body just ignores the recessive allele and follows the dominant allele. So you would end up brown in both your eyes if you have the brown allele. blue allele. And we'll talk more about dominant alleles and recessive alleles when we get to the chapter on Mendelian genetics. But for right now, I just want to mention this word heterozygous. Any organism that has two different alleles for a gene is said to be heterozygous for that gene. So if these were your parents and you got there we go, and you got the brown allele for the eye color gene from one parent and the blue allele for the eye color gene from another parent, you have different alleles for the same gene, you are heterozygous for that particular gene. Hetero meaning different. Now, let's say instead of Mel and Barbara, your parents were Mel and Meg Ryan. Well, they both have blue eyes, and so you would get the blue-eyed allele from both your parents. Like that, and in that case, you're said to be homozygous for that gene if you have the exact same allele for it. And obviously, in this case, you would have blue eyes because that's the only allele that you got. All right. All right. So I think that will conclude our chapter on chromosomes. When we get to the chapter on Mendelian genetics, all these terms, alleles and heterozygous and homozygous, are going to come roaring back as we learn about the patterns of inheritance of traits. So don't forget them. We're now going to jump into a chapter on mitosis. Not your tosis, mitosis. All right. Mitosis is basically about cellular reproduction, how cells reproduce and how cells make more cells, so to speak. So recall that at the moment of conception, at the moment of fertilization, we all start off life as this single cell called the zygote, which comes from the egg and the sperm fusing together. So the zygote is a diploid cell. It has two sets of 23 chromosomes, so 46 chromosomes. And what happens then, just within hours of fertilization, the zygote starts to divide because it's got a lot of dividing to do. It only has 9 months to go from one tiny little microscopic cell to a full-blown newborn baby that has trillions of cells. And here's some photographs. This is a zygote right there, and just within a few hours, it has divided into 2 cells. So technically, this is the beginning of the embryo. Then each of those cells divide, so then you have 4 cells, and each of those then divide, then you have 8 cells, and then 16, 32, and 64, and 128, and then more division and more division and more division. And it all happens pretty rapidly. I guess that's a geometric growth where it keeps doubling every time period. At 4 weeks, you don't have to know these numbers, but I looked these up. At 4 weeks, the zygote has divided into 1 billion cells, which is not bad for just 4 weeks of division. By 7 weeks, it's up to 4 billion cells. Kind of neat. Start to see the eyes and the hands and the legs and everything's forming there. By 14 weeks, the fetus has 140 billion cells. By 20 weeks, 400 billion cells. Wow. And by the time the baby is born, 4 trillion cells is what it's up to. And of course, the cellular division doesn't stop at that point because the kid keeps growing. So you get it to adulthood, and adults have around 75 trillion cells in their body, all of which came from that one zygote. There we go. All of which came from that one zygote. And since all the cells in your adult body came from that one zygote cell, all of your cells are diploid cells, with the exception of your reproductive cells.
Is there a point where they stop?
Really? No, yeah, it's a good question. Some tissues in your body do stop growing, like the nervous tissue that makes your brain. By the time you're born, you're never going to grow any more neurons. And your muscle cells also. Your muscles get bigger, but not because you get more muscle cells. Your muscle cells just expand in size. And so those guys never divide. But other tissues in your body, like your skin, do keep dividing throughout your entire life. And if you injure yourself, some of the cells will regrow and fill it in with scar tissue. So it kind of varies from tissue to tissue. Yeah.
You said that the cells in your brain don't reproduce?
That's correct. You're born with a certain number of neurons in your brain, and by and large, you're never going to get any more.
So when, not to say like someone will make a new connection, when there's brain damage, someone makes a connection to do something that they did before, but in a different way in the brain, they make a new...
What's happening is the neurons that are still alive in the person's brain will rewire themselves to connect to each other in new ways, but you don't get any new neurons, is the point. Lewis?
The cerebellum was where the production of neurons is in the brain, so I thought there was actually a concept of lab neurons being developed. That's not true.
From my understanding is that there's pretty much no growth of neurons after you're born. Maybe you're talking about before you're born, when you're a fetus, then those neurons are still developing. Now, I seem to recall several years back, someone did a study that showed, at least in rats, a few neurons grew during the rat's lifetime, but that seems to be a very, very small number. By and large, the neurons you have do not reproduce. Yeah. One?
Mary says this is how cells reproduce. Are these eukaryotes and multicellular organisms, prokaryotes, all?
What I'm covering here refers to eukaryotic cells, but pretty much all eukaryotes, whether they're single-celled eukaryotes or multicellular eukaryotes. But we're going to look at how prokaryotes divide a little bit later on this semester, and some of this does apply to prokaryotes also. All right, there's one more thing about cellular growth I was going to mention. Here is cancer. The disease cancer is also, it's a type of cellular growth, but it's abnormal cellular growth. What happens in cancer is some of the cells in your body that are not supposed to be dividing, or at least not supposed to be dividing very rapidly, suddenly lose control and start dividing very, very rapidly. This is these red cells represent cancer cells that happen to be breast cancer, but it could really be any cancer anywhere in your body. So they start reproducing themselves in a wild, fast, uncontrolled manner. And so what happens is they tend to destroy whatever organ they're in. The clump of cancer cells is called a tumor. And so as it grows, it wrecks the structure of whatever organ it's in. And unfortunately, what can happen is individual cancer cells can break off from the main tumor and then travel in the blood vessels to other parts of the body, and so they can cause new tumors to grow called metastatic tumors, where you say metastasis has occurred, where the cancer spreads to other organs and ends up wrecking the structure of those organs, and in the end it can be fatal depending on what type of cancer it is and if the treatment was successful or not. So anyway, this chapter on mitosis is all about how cells reproduce. And in many cases, it's good reproduction, like growth and development and repairing injuries. But in some cases, it's abnormal reproduction, like you get in cancer.
For a cancer cell, when it leaves and it enters the bloodstream and lands somewhere else, how does it affect the other cells? It just sort of implants itself in whatever new organ it happened to land in. And then those cancer cells keep growing. And I think what happens is essentially they push aside the other tissues. As the tumor grows, it just literally pushes aside the other tissues. And so it wrecks their connections and their blood vessels and things. And eventually the organ just stops functioning well. Okay, so how do cells reproduce is a good way to start this. You may wonder, well, inside my body, are there boy cells and girl cells? And do they get married and have babies with each other? There we go. No, nothing goofy like that.
Cells reproduce just by dividing in half. They don't date each other or anything like that. So one cell will essentially just divide in half and make two cells, and that is how cells reproduce, just by dividing. And they use the term the mother cell as the cell that divides, and the two cells it turns into are called the daughter cell. So there's a mother cell, and it splits in half, and you get two daughter cells out of it. Now there's a certain order of operations when a cell is going to divide. The first thing that happens is its nucleus divides first. That is, within the mother cell, the nucleus divides and moves to opposite sides of the cell, and then only after nuclear division does the rest of the cell divide, and that step is called cytokinesis, when the membrane and the cytoplasm divide also. And here's a little cartoon of that. There's the original mother cell. So step one, nuclear division. And they sometimes say the poles of the cell. They say that the nucleus divides and moves to opposite poles of the cell, as if that was the North Pole and that was the South Pole of the Earth or something like that. And then after nuclear division, you get cytokinesis, when the cytoplasm and the membranes split in two, and then you end up with the two daughter cells. All right. Now.